Good evening. You're listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob, broadcasting to you from the Pinos Palace, just west of Orlando, Florida. I'm here to talk to you tonight solo, unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties with RDV from the great Midwest, about a movie on Netflix that came out 3 years ago that I think is appropriate to discuss right now. It's called Extraction, starring Thor, the Hemsworth guy, not the two scrub Hemsworths. This is an interesting movie, Extraction. When it came out, it was a Netflix special. It's got a really slick budget, 60, 70 million for it. And I had attempted to watch it a few years back when it came out. Didn't get too far into it for certain reasons, and then rewatched it this morning. And it's important to discuss because I'm going to compare this to the John Wick franchise and action movies in general. And with our technical difficulties, hopefully people out there in streaming our land can hear us okay. We'll see if RDB can pop in. He's having some technical difficulties on his end. We'll see what happens here for tonight. So Extraction. The problem with this movie opening up is you don't really feel anything for the main character. He's a guy that's heavily on pills. He's one of those kind of guys that his shot never misses. He's a stud. And frankly, he's a good looking guy. He's physically fit, looks the role, and he's powerful built. It's something where you go, okay, I believe him. And so that adds to it. But in terms of character development, this movie is about as paper thin as you can get. Unfortunately, this movie seems a bit dull when you first start watching it. And then when the action starts kicking in, you're like, okay, this is acceptable. However, where this movie differentiates itself from John Wick is the fact that I think it's the director was a stunt choreographer of some kind and ended up directing this. So the action scenes are shot completely different than most action films. There's less of a reliance on CGI in here, and there's more of an emphasis on capturing different action sequences. For example, there's a very, very long extended one-shot sequence in this film that, you know, if you're like me, I'm partial to them. I like long continuous takes, whether it's a still cam shot, like say a John Carpenter, or back even with I think it was True Detective season one with Matthew McConaughey, where there's a scene where they're coincidentally extricating somebody from I think a small room at night, and it takes like 10-15 minutes from them doing it. It seems to be a one-shot take. This film has that. It's got a great car chase. It's got some great hand-to-hand action where he actually holds the knife in what looks to be the correct position. Instead of stabbing down, you've got it lower and you swing up with it. So there's a lot of little details like that in this film that are absolutely breathtaking, which save the film. So what's the film about? It's about a guy, like I say, that's perfect basically at his job, and he's hired to get a little boy back basically from one thug from another, but there's some kind of a double cross and something else happens into it. And I won't get too much into the plot because it's not really necessary for it. But what makes it interesting too is the choice of locale, which is over in India. You get some incredible overhead shots of where they're at, and people seem to forget on the world stage when you're watching American movies, even if you're watching Bollywood, Bollywood has a tendency to do the glamour shtick to it, and even though cultures have a tendency to copy other cultures' hit movies and make it their own, sometimes you forget just how incredibly populous the continent of India is and their cities and how dense they are. Typically, we think of like say Hong Kong for that, and other places in Asia, but here you definitely get the feel of it. And I think the eye that the director has, and this makes this movie, watchable visually. The cinematography is pretty damn good. And like I say, capturing the action, absolutely fantastic. Um, it's one of those situations where when you're watching a film, like I say, if this is your type of film and you like action films, it's worth watching because it's so, to me, different than John Wick. And here's where it's a little bit different. Before we get piling in here, I'll talk about a couple things here. I'm looking at chat, seeing if RDV is able to pop in. I'm not seeing that. He's my guest typically. Yeah, Verity. Hey, well, glad to have you back here. This is Extraction on Netflix currently, starring Thor. This is a pretty interesting movie because some of the things I mentioned just before, I'll touch on again. Great cinematography. The action sequences are incredible. With John Wick, comparing this to it, John Wick, let's take a step back. Big budgets. It's pretty much one note. I liked 4 better than the other 2. The first John Wick, I think, was the best. Where John Wick, I think, excels is that it started off as a character, and because it was so popular and kind of a unique perspective on action films. And again, a lot of the gun choreography is tremendous, but it's so one note, even with extended sequences, which I like because it's like he almost never misses, and it's just very video game-ish. What I liked about John Wick 4, there was a particular scene there with some unique incendiary ammo in a sequence that was extended with an overhead cam like shot as he was going up a building. So the change of perspective was really cool, but it was more artistic. Here in Extraction, it's a bit more brutal because the violence in here is definitely very gory. It's it's not over the top gory like you might think of, say, with a more Evil Dead recent movie that got released. That was gory for gory's sake, not even for Evil Dead comedy sake. That's a separate discussion about whether or not that helped that movie, because definitely that movie needed some help. But in Extraction, you go, yeah, I'm feeling the brutality and how tough this assignment is for him. So the scene kind of opens up where he's with some buddies and they're kind of chilling, and you can see him. It's like he almost has a death wish. He jumps off, cliff diving into a pool, and then he's like meditating on the ground. And he's having flashbacks, and it's like, I get it, kind of don't care. Um, it's just one of those things where, like I say, character wise, you feel a little bit flat, and if you're not hooked early on, it might be a tough watch for you to get into. When you don't have a character that you don't care about, then the action is not necessarily something that makes up for it. But this movie does a very good job of coming very close to it. The bad guys, you get bad guys that might look like bad guys. They're not necessarily intimidating. I wouldn't say they're wimps. I think where they're shot and how the movie's shot, the atmosphere of it makes you almost believe in that these people are somewhat real. So again, the cinematography I think saves this film. It's interesting that you get some perspectives in this movie with bad guys because cops are bad in this film. You get bad guys on top of buildings having discussions with high level important people. In one scene, there's a guy telling the colonel, "Hey, shut down the city," and he's like, "That's impossible." And he's like, "You better make it possible, or you're going to lose more than just your finger." And it's like, yeah, okay, whatever, stupid dialogue. But again, the setting, natural light, outdoors, it's good. Um, there's an Extraction 2 coming out, I believe, this summer, and I think they're going to go ahead with what was very popular about this film, was going for that very, very long 10 to 15 minute, one continuous take action sequence in here. And here, if you take a look at this film, if nothing more, if you have a couple decent scenes, some stuff that you can pull away and remember, usually that what makes a film. Hopefully, you don't have anything terribly bad in it. Okay, that's one line of thinking of movies. I think that was John Ford's. Yeah, I'm afraid of the sequel to Verity. I'm just not sure how it's going to work because this is huge budget for Netflix. And I know Netflix says, well, we will spend these big budget on movies, so it's our own property. So what happens with a budget usually gets bigger, usually gets worse. Um, I I don't know how a 60-70 million dollar movie translates into more than 60 or 70 million on the plus side of the ledger for Netflix, and that's where Netflix has had issues because they've had to rely on subscriber growth for their financial model. And while I understand that and appreciate it, by the time they'd get to a season 3 or 4, the way contracts escalate, they'd always have to spend more money on. Usually that's why they'd cancel them. Not unless they had a certifiable major hit on their hand. But even still, over the past few years, they've changed from subscriber growth, at least popularizing it externally, to pump their stock price. It's been more of a minutes watch metric because we all know that they've changed their grading system, where before things would get bombed, where they didn't want to have that because they want to have this appearance in their internal culture when you're viewing what programs to watch of, everything's good, just some things are more good than others, rather than, wow, everybody says this sucks. Amazon, of course, is the major guilty party, but certainly both companies aren't immune to that. So again, Extraction, unfortunately, when something like this comes out on Netflix, what do you do for promoting it? So if this were a regular release that costs, say, 60, 70 million, you might have 20 to 30 million on advertising in different media outlets. And it's not to say Netflix didn't, but usually that's where they scrimp because it kind of came and went. And even though it was during COVID or right around that time, I think action movies themselves are something that people really, really want to get into. I think that when you take a look at John Wick, it's slick, so it's kind of hip. And I think if you're from an older generation and you're watching action movies, you're used to more of the extraction type movies. If you're older, if you're younger, I think John Wick's kind of redefined currently what action movies are. It's a cross of the chaotic 50 million flash cuts and crash zooms of, Jason Bourne, but really more of the CGI spectacle that the majority of all these tentpole franchises are from the DC and Marvel universe, which to me are an abomination to watch. They're just ghastly. They're visually not appealing at all. And it's cool that you can do anything with CGI, but when it looks fake and you know it's not, and it's comics, it's hard to suspend it. When you have more of the, like I say, shooting in natural light locations. Again, here you have India, you have Australia, you have other places. You've got your drone shots, you've got this and that. It adds some believability to it. And Hemsworth himself, we know that he's put on a lot of weight to do Thor and all that. And it's one of those actors that, like I say, you believe him in a role. He's just not somebody that runs a cycle, puts on 20, 30 pounds, grows a beard, and puts on a suit, and automatically you believe him. Um, Keanu's somebody that's been around a really long time, so he's had a lot of his kung fu and gun experience, so he can handle it, and he looks like he knows it. It's just sometimes, like I say, the extended amounts of bodies just popping out of nowhere and dropping just to show you technique gets rather dull to me. But again, if it's exciting and you like it, that's what's cool. In Extraction, you have a chance to in these action scenes to breathe. There's one scene I want to talk about a little bit that happens kind of early on that kind of gives you a taste of what the rest of it's going to be. It's where you're having a fight, and I'd mentioned at the beginning that what caught my eye here is I think it was The Hunted with Benicio del Toro and somebody else. It's a real great actor whose name escapes me at the top of my head, from The Fugitive, Tommy Lee Jones. And Tommy Lee Jones is the mentor to Benicio del Toro in a certain particular style of hand-to-hand fighting using weapons, which you don't hold the blade where the blade comes up, it comes down from your palm, and you use these kind of slashing strokes, and you keep it out in front of you. There's none of these crazy wild swings or like jabs and crosses like you'd have in boxing. So it's very tight and uniform. Somebody in the background's probably like Krav Maga and all this other inside stuff or some other Israeli thing, but really you don't see a lot of, I think, proper knife fighting technique on the big screen. And that's why this movie totally benefits from somebody that's got the eye of how to film this, what looks good. Because what's effective in real life is not necessarily what looks good on screen. And Scott Adkins himself in John Wick 4, I thought, kind of stole it. That's a great scene, it's a great character. When you hear him talk about what they went through on John Wick, to how to film it, how to say have a front kick where you can look at it and film it where it looks realistic, but again, real life may not be the most effective. You got your movie shot and your real life shot, and when you have people like that are so technically skilled, it's great that it's there, and John Wick does excel at that. But here in Extraction, like I say, not only do you have the gunfighting, you've got some of the sniper stuff, you've got a car chase, which I will talk about here in a moment. This knife fighting scene, it's great because you can tell that the person filming it is right there, like he's almost in the fight. You've got two guys going at it, Hemsworth and a goon. And the goon looks, not like he's 140 pounds. He looks legit tough too. And they're going at it, and it looks like it's real time. And since it's on this kind of street alleyway that's really, really confined, you're hearing the chickens in the background, you're hearing the horns, you're hearing people talking. You've got cars, the really smaller ones that are going back and forth that interrupt them while they're fighting. I'm watching this go, oh my God, this is a really, really good action scene. But it's not a knife fighting movie. It's just a scene that has that in it, right? Now, you compare that to a really long sequence in here that I thought is tremendous that involves a car chase. From what I understand, after watching this, when I went and looked at the director and how they shot it, apparently the director for this car chase scene, and I think you'll know it from the way it looks, he actually strapped himself, I think, to the front of a car going about 40, 50, 60 miles an hour so he could capture that kind of real time. That's just badass. Because it's like when you see the shot from, say, a passenger side or a driver's side. Of course, the car, typically the way this is filmed mostly is the car is being dragged, so you're just kind of fake steering it and all that. Or you have your guys going the same side on a ramp next to you, and it captures it, and we've seen that before. But this just looks better. It just looks like you're in the middle of all this action. It was really, really, really cool. And foot chases, let's talk that. A lot of times you get chases from above. I'm going back to You Only Live Twice with James Bond, where there's a scene where he's at the vitamin C factory at the top and he's fighting all these goons, and it's a helicopter shot, which would now be a drone shot. And it's kind of cool in a way. you've seen that a lot, but when you saw the Bourne movies and you see him jumping from one building to another, and it looks like the guy's right behind him jumping and filming it in the air, it's incredible. So the foot chase scene in here where he's going through and he's got the kid that he's helping get out of from the bad guy's clutches, it's really cool because there's some close quarter stuff. There's some, hey, we're running through, we're popping through a door, now we're outside, and of course you got the camera running behind him, so it's a little shaky cam, but not intentionally shaky cam. And again, it feels like you're in the middle of it, like you are right behind them, backing them up, going through stuff. So when the camera turns and rotates, you really quickly have your eyes capture what he's looking at too, and it adds more to than what you would have with a static shot, let's say, where the camera's still and you see two people going at it. That can be effective. So, like I say, where this movie excels, I think, in the cinematography is a lot of the different types of styles that you have in here. But not only that, you've got the different capturings of it, some static stuff, some long shots, but then also some close in ones. You also have a lot of the seamless transitions from using both. And that's always a big difference. When you get something like John Wick and using Scott Adkins' character near Killa, it's a great little slow burn at the beginning because the people sit down, you know there's going to be a fight. Why? Rules number 101 in movies. If you're in a bar, there's going to be a fight. That's just how it goes. But instead, Kella does the car thing. And then, of course, eventually it erupts into a fight, and you get a mild pause and a release of that tension at the end when he dies. I think the fight could have been a little bit longer. I want to see a little bit more Killa, but they left you wanting more, which is usually the right thing. Blade did this tremendously, back timing the fight scenes and the choreography and the escalation until you would hit something really, really at the end intense, like when Blade's yelling Frost towards the end as he's going through. Then he gets the blade and does the little half turn to it and all that before the final battle. That's how you time a movie and get you pumped up for it. It's not the moves, it's not the body count, it's the rhythm of the scene of the fight, whether it's hand to hand, swords, guns, whatever it is. That kind of timing is what you're looking for, and this movie has it. Honestly, the first time I watched it, I thought it was a little bit boring because I didn't really care about any of the characters, whether they lived or they died. Yeah, the bad guys were kind of whatever, and they're just there. And I really wasn't feeling the vibe for it. But if you watch this with a different perspective about going, okay, this is going to be different than John Wick, I think, and pointing out some of those things, I think you gain a different perspective on it. Because for me, it took a second watching to really get into it and appreciate it for what it is. It's a movie that I would rewatch? Not necessarily. It's not a fun action movie. It's certainly not a comedy like you might get out of Jackie Chan's, which I have a tendency to not care for, but they're still fun. It's not a canon classic where you've got, say, a bunch of ninjas coming at you ninja style one at a time, where you get to see something. It's certainly no Jim Connor, which is absolutely ludicrous and stupid, but you go in there with a grin on your face knowing what you're getting. This movie actually surprised me, like I said, on the second rewatch with it going, yeah, they kind of tried showing you as a watcher just how intense it can be. And again, the plot, do you really care about it? No. Is there a lot of over the top talking? Not necessarily. But it made me think of John Wick a lot. Made me think that's where action movies are at today. They're either in this a really lavish, slickly produced style of John Wick, which is mind numbing. I'm not saying it's not done well or it's not entertaining, but I want more visceral action. I want more realistic believability in it. I really want things like that happening. John Wick, I think it's great, but you don't see the difficulty with the people that are in fights because it's all perfectly choreographed. There's no, it's completely rehearsed and it feels that way. And this movie here, again, even though the action sequence is that way, it just feels a bit more difficult. And that's what fights are. They're not easy. They're supposed to be fatiguing. They're supposed to make you go, shit, I only got so much energy left. And you actually do feel a little bit of the juice leaving him, when he's trying to get the copter and get out of town and he realizes he's gotten screwed and the police are in on it. It's a little bit more realistic that way. And to compare it to a '90s movie that is kind of an action movie in a way, I'll go to Sniper with Tom Berenger and that whole sequence there. That was one of the first movies that really popularized what it meant to shoot long term and the sniper mentality of, one shot, one kill. I'm in a jungle. I'm going to use my skills. It was a nice little character piece. And of course, Tom Berenger is completely worth watching on anything, really. It had Billy Zane in it too, who I thought did a good job. Where he again, you have the mentor-mentee relationship, and here you don't have that. So when the sequel comes out, I'm really curious to see what they can do with it. Because if it's just a rehash of this, I don't know. Not saying you have to make it bigger. I'm not saying you have to make it better because there's a lot of good things in here. But again, from A to B, if I look at this film, I'd be like, eh. But again, technically, it's very good. It's like watching somebody makes a dinner that's really, really good. You appreciate their knife skills. The presentation's great. But you're like, "Yeah, I could do the same thing for 1/10 the price at home. It tastes just almost as good," it's kinda like, why bother? So, the hook that's gonna draw you into seeing Extraction 2, I don't know what that is, other than they're promising you and they're promoting heavily on Twitter, if you look for it and everywhere else, another really long action sequence here too. So, I will give the second one a watch just because of how the first one came out. Again, it took me a second rewatch to kind of get the feel of it. I know that typically when we talk action movies here on the Extreme Movie Show, that's, we always say that we're 80s based and RDV from the Great Midwest. He and I have a fondness for, like, say, Chuck Norris and the people that were real fighters and the physicality of those kinds of things and building up to a particular scene, that sort of formula for it. And we kind of compare other movies to it. So I'm really interested in what his feedback would be on it. So I think when Extraction 2 comes out, will be kind of getting his take on it and looking at it. Sniper, again, from the early 90s, I want to say 92 or 93. If you haven't seen it, Verity, I think that's a decent one. Um, you would like a different story. You don't want the same, but longer and more expensive. Here's the thing. This movie is a long movie. It's roughly 2 hours long, and it feels like it. That's not necessarily bad, but if you're not used to that, it's like John Wick. At some point with John Wick, it's like, get on with it. It was like slow and mud because everybody expects John Wick to be like Hardcore Henry, where it's nonstop action. Parkour and the camera following you from that first person perspective sort of view. That's kind of cool. But Sniper is definitely worth a watch, at least the first one, so you can see what I'm talking about. How action films, kind of from the '80s, and we'll kind of start closing shop up here a little bit with this observation. In the '80s, you had people going big and loud and bombastic, kind of like the '80s style, lots of guns and explosions. And while it's entertaining, you saw it really hit a peak with, say, Terminator 2, True Lies, and other films like it. So then more of the character driven, more of this type of action, a lot of that was starting to go to the VHS market, like Sniper 2, Sniper 3. Not that a sequel wouldn't necessarily make it to the big screen, but that secondary market and then eventually the DVD market, and then of course we that's still in existence in a way. Now you got video on demand, you can make something cheap. Steven Seagal is a perfect example. He's a guy that gets shit on a lot, but he had a good run there of a couple of films, and then basically in the '90s and even, gosh, I hate to say it, Jean-Claude Van Damme, a guy I really like. They found a lot of success in their basically second career was pumping out VHS, DVD type movies where you can make it cheaply and still make them effective. And to kind of keep it full circle, I'm gonna go back to the character avatar I have here with Kelly and Scott Adkins. The first time I saw Scott Adkins was in an action movie, and it's because I said, you know what? Let me pound out. I was craving some action films. I don't know if Netflix had them or Amazon or what. So let me watch Universal Soldier, not two, but like three, four, and five. And I saw this guy that was real flippity floppity, and then there's some ninja movies were on. I'm like, hey, that's the same dude. And I looked him up, and it's Scott Adkins. So I said, I don't know who this guy is, but he looks like a legit martial artist. And he himself will tell you that he really was inspired by like Jean Claude and all those guys from the '80s. So I appreciate the fact that he's inspired by the type of action movies I grew up on, because he's like one of the last few guys I think that you'd go to a movie and see. Um, he's a martial artist, where of course this movie is an action movie, not a martial arts movie. So again, it's just different and it just depends on what you like. This movie's worth a watch, if nothing more for action films, to give you a different perspective on what's out there. Kudos to Scott Adkins for a memorable character. He's a guy that's in a ton of stuff, but I wouldn't say he's necessarily mainstream unless you know what you're looking for. Keanu could actually have had a great career without the John Wick films. It's a nice little secondary thing, but the action film genre is kind of kind of degraded into, hey, I'm Liam Neeson. I'm a tall, older, big guy or whatever. I fall on success in a movie that was done kind of clever and Taken. And then we joke about taking on a plane, taking on a train, taking on a train, whatever. Um, you see the diminishing returns with that. We'll see if that happens here with Extraction too. I'm gonna check the comments out here, see if anybody else is in there. I know Comic Book Frog's talking about how he loved it and he wants to talk about that in the sequel. I agree with you, Frog. It was going to be an interesting discussion because, like I said, the first time I watched it, I was kind of bored by it and didn't care. But once the action got going, it's like, okay, let me watch this scene. And then it kind of continued. Really, really, really good. All right, guys. We'll call it for the night. That's Extraction on Netflix with Hemsworth. I like my description about evil guys sipping wine on top in a castle and kids getting thrown off a roof. I'll just leave it at that and see what you think of the film, too. Tuesday night. 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central. We'll be continuing our review of Rabbit Hole, Kiefer Sutherland. Check that out. And then we'll be back next Sunday with probably another action film to be determined. If you have any particular suggestions of anything that you want the Xtreme treatment to, let us know. We'll be happy to take a look at that. We appreciate the engagement. Most importantly, we appreciate you just spending some time with us. And of course, if you choose to let people know we exist, that's super appreciated, as well as we're well on our march to getting monetized here and producing even more content for all you extremists out there. For RDV and Spirit, I'm your host, Rob, here on Xtreme News Show. Have a good night. Remember, stay extreme.